I'm going to go ahead and stop because I'm way over. Sorry, and I'll go ahead and take your questions and comments. And thank you. That's a good question. Do I see any connection between Zionism and fascism? Was that correct? Okay, good. Okay, I didn't want to answer a question that I just made up in my head. But, that's happened before. Don't laugh. Like it happens regularly. That's not what I asked. Anyway, it's a tricky question because I don't see. I would not see Zionism as in any way synonymous with fascism. And fascism is one of those terms that we like to throw out, like for any situation that has repression involved in it, like, anything from my parents are being fascists, right, to to this or that government is fascist, right? And so I don't want to use that term loosely, but nor am I a political scientist who studies fascism, so I don't feel like I have a requisite academic understanding of exactly what it entails, but generally I have not thought of Zionism as a fascist movement. It seems to me fundamentally different than what fascism has done historically, particularly in Western Europe of the World War II era and beyond. But I certainly think that under the rubric of Zionism, which is a very broad ideology and has all kinds of different variations and all kinds of different levels of commitment, that it certainly can accommodate certain iterations of fascism. But I would probably say the same of nearly every other political label or political ideology as well, that there are variants of Arab nationalism that also can accommodate fascism, right? And that there are variants of anti-colonialism even that can accommodate fascism. But I think it's important though to even if in our daily conversation we like to use political terminologies loosely, and I'm guilty of this, right? Just like grammar Nazi. Just think about that, right? Or fascist, right? Or just things that we just sort of bandy about and toss around. But so that we can kind of deplete those words of power and deplete our understanding of their specificity. And so I think that we ought to understand Zionism as Zionism, and we ought to understand fascism as fascism, if that makes any sense. But I definitely wouldn't see them as synonymous.
Joy?
I was going to say, I really like how you pointed out that one of the problems that even Israelis face with their own government is that as soon as you criticize the government, they try to use that as you're criticizing the faith.
Right.
And that's why, like, when the Constitution was written up, they decided to separate government from religion, so that you can criticize your government without having to be held accountable to your religion.
Right.
Which led to the inquisitions in Spain.
Right.
So that's kind of like even Israelis in their own government are having to face that issue. Just the government just barreling down on them and kind of having this inquisition of them.
Mm-hmm. Right. Right. Thank you. Yeah, and it's a problem of politics. I don't want to say universally, but almost universally. I'm sure somewhere in the world there are exceptions, but it's the idea that a criticism of a nation state or of a government or an institution is a fundamental betrayal of a people. But you see that in the U.S. too. Like even inscribing the right to dissent in law doesn't stop punishment from happening. Very often informally, right? So like if you, I'm sure you've seen, you all are you all are online, right? That you can criticize, let's say, the Iraq War. I feel like this is a little bit before your time for most of you, right? And be called un-American, right? Or you can even criticize Donald Trump and be outfitted with a label that suggests that you hate the entire U.S. polity. right? Well, I mean, in many cases that's true. I'm sure there are some people who criticize Trump who can't stand the entire U.S. polity, right? But but the fact that we're so quick to attribute a kind of hateful sensibility that derives from or is inferred from a singular criticism tells us that people the world over, including in the United States, are way too invested in states and governments as sites of their own sort of identity or as sites of personhood. And so I would argue that it's important and useful and necessary and liberating to try to divest yourselves, right, from governments and institutions as a political being and start thinking of yourself as being in community instead, right, with fellow human beings, right? Like I like to think of myself not as a loyal subject of the U.S. government. F that. No government's getting my loyalty, right? But getting my loyalty are fellow human beings. Black Lives Matter is getting my loyalty. Palestinian refugees are getting my loyalty, right? Muslims are getting my loyalty. People who are facing oppression, people who are suffering the depredations of power are getting my loyalty and my solidarity, not governments, right? So in that sense, you can call me, and you can call critics of the U.S. government anti-American. Okay, fine, but you can't call me racist. You can't call me sexist, right? You can't call me unempathetic or uncaring. And so that's just, I'm editorializing, I know, forgive me. Because that was a very good comment you made, but I guess this is my way of saying that think about sort of interjecting yourself into spaces of multi-ethnic community rather than in sites of governmental power as a source of political sustenance, I guess. Other questions, comments?
Mariah? Hello.
Hi.
Do you find the American withdrawal from UNESCO as surprising or as foundational to American tradition?
Okay. She asked about the U.S. Withdrawal from UNESCO and if I'm surprised by it, or
if it's similar to American tradition.
Or if it's similar to American tradition. I wasn't surprised by it, but nor have I. And I don't want you to think I'm being flippant towards your question because it's a really good question, but I haven't spent much time thinking about it or reading about it. So I only know the broad outlines of the story. I'm not quite sure exactly what I don't know that any of us are quite sure exactly what happened, right? But I don't even know what the official media story is saying. But I tend to think of these things as more symbolic than material. Maybe that's not the case here, but I don't think that it's going to fundamentally affect what's happening on the ground in Palestine or in the United States. That it's that these seem to be cheap political points, and politicians love scoring cheap political points. Sure.
The growing threat to academic freedom that you discuss and that you speak out about, would you say that, or have you ever spoken out, or would you ever speak out for the threat to academic freedom posed by the BDS movement in banning Israeli professors on campuses in this country and around the world?
Mm-hmm. If BDS were to, oh, sorry, did you all hear? Okay. The gentleman pointed out that I'm speaking against academic freedom. Would I speak out against the violations of academic freedom of BDS for banning Israelis from the country? Is that
Well, it's a threat to academic freedom. You can't argue for one and not the other.
okay? Did you hear that? Okay. Just wanted to make sure that everybody heard the question. If BDS were to involve itself in the business of banning people of certain nationalities from this or any other country, then I would oppose it. But the fact of the matter is, BDS does not support that kind of ban. There's nothing in the BDS literature. More important, there's nothing in the BDS history that says Israelis will be banned. That's
part of the boycott.
That's not part of the boycott. That's part
It
of the
happens
mythology
in
of
camps
opposition
all
to
over the
boycott.
world.
Give me an example of an Israeli who has been banned.
There are 4 of them in the UK alone in the last 2 years. In Canada and in the United States.
Really?
Yeah.
Who are they?
I don't remember their names. But
Okay.
they
Nobody's being banned. This is the American Studies Association, after its boycott resolution, hosted Israeli scholars the very next year. There's, again, if anybody is being banned, it is not as a result of anybody associated with the BDS movement. And I think furthermore, and this is the more important point, BDS has grown out of a need to protect an entire people whose fundamental rights are daily violated. Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza attend universities that are regularly invaded and looted, sometimes that are bombed. They can't make it to classes because of checkpoints. Hell, the people in Gaza can't even make it to get medical treatment for cancer. They cannot travel to the United States. They can't travel to Western Europe. Even if they get visas to these places, right, which is an extremely difficult thing to do, it is far from certain. In fact, it's highly unlikely that Israel will even let them leave. What we're talking about is a systematic violation, not only of academic freedom, but of civil liberties and of human rights. Systematic violations that affect millions of people. We're talking about, again, 5 million people just in the Palestinian occupied territories itself. This is not to say anything about the nearly 2 million Arab citizens of Israel or of the Palestinians who live in Lebanese refugee camps where they don't even have Lebanese citizenship. Don't even get me started on that either. All right, this is to say nothing also of the dozens of Students for Justice in Palestine chapters that have been shut down, that have been fined, that have been suspended, the activists who have been criminalized, the activists that have been dragged in front of courts. This is to say nothing also of the professors who have been fired, the professors who have been otherwise disciplined, the professors who have been publicly thrown under the bus by their universities as they're facing all kinds of racist backlash. This is to say nothing also of the fact that if you look at every single job ad in every single social sciences and humanities discipline in the English language world, do it. Seriously, go do it. You will not find the word Palestine in any single one of them. Palestine scarcely exists as a field of study in U.S. universities. This is the level of systematic abuse of rights that we are talking about. This is the level of violation that Palestinians all around the world have to face on a daily basis. Right? And so that cannot be mitigated by the vague invocation of possibly 4 scholars who were not allowed into the United Kingdom. I will not support any movement, political movement, that gets in the business of banning or outlawing. And I invite everybody in this room to read up about BDS, read what it allows and doesn't allow, and make up your own mind on the subject.
We have Thus Speak first, if that's okay. Thus Speak, just ask your question.
So, what can college students do to encourage more academic freedom on college campuses?
Okay. That's it. She asked, what can colleges do to encourage more academic freedom on campus? Students, sorry.
What can college students do to encourage more academic freedom?
What can college students do? Okay. I thought you said what can colleges do, and I was just like, I don't know. To take the stick out and like quit, I don't know, but college students, that's a great, I think that I think college students should engage themselves in these sorts of debates. First of all, you can see that we're having a conversation, right, where people are disagreeing with one another and are sort of volleying back and forth with one another. Right? You weigh the evidence, right? You get to ask a question if you want to ask a question. You might not get an answer that you like. You might get an answer that satisfies you. But the point is that this is one of the most important things of college. In fact, almost all of my memories from college, and I was a nerd. I'll admit that I was a nerd, all right, which is a good thing. You should own it if you are, right? Was not of my classes or specific classes, but of going and watching lectures. I still remember in 1993, I was a freshman, and Noam Chomsky came, all right? I was 17, maybe had just turned 18, and I didn't know anything about him, right? I just knew this guy's famous, you should go see him, right? And I think one of my professors, I still remember what he was wearing. I still remember what he said. Right? I still remember what he said. So these are memories that last a long time. So what I'm saying is the first thing that college students can do to help protect academic freedom is by participating in the intellectual life of your campus. Right? You learn a lot that way. You learn how sort of debate functions, how it should function, right? And where you fit into it. Another thing that students can do is by, I think, continuing to grow. I'm trying to think of the right word. Bear with me. I don't want to choose a word that's in any way insulting, but to sort of grow hip to the way that repression works, right? And we're here not just talking about Palestine, but all kinds of things, and to understand that the administrative class, right, the upper administrators on almost any campus in the United States, right, is devoted first and foremost to the perpetuation of wealth on the campus, right, and not to the legitimate, genuine well-being of students and faculty, right? And it sounds awfully cynical. It will never lead you astray, right? It's one of those things that you keep sort of thinking of it as a rule and you keep being proven right. And also that includes in particular students from the most marginalized background on campus. So think about being in solidarity with those who most need it, to think about ways to help raise the voices of those who most need to be heard. I'm thinking again, in this environment, right, I'm thinking about black students, black women students, natives, right, indigenous peoples, Muslims who are facing a lot of hate crimes, right, Jews who are facing a lot of hate crimes, any sort of ethnic or religious minority community, right, and we had to think about ways of protecting them and making sure that they not only fit onto campus, but that they're welcome on campus. And this is part and parcel of protecting academic freedom, because always the first casualties of any restriction on academic freedom are those who most need its protections. Right? And those who most need its protections obviously are the ones who are either controversial by fiat of their very existence or who are more likely to raise a controversial politic. Does that make sense? I don't know if I'm making any sense, but otherwise, yeah, be engaged, understand how the system works, understand how management works. If the faculty union, right, there's a faculty union here, isn't there, or am I lying? No, there's a faculty union here, yeah. If they have an event, go. Turn out to it. Learn how things work. It's not as boring as it might seem. It's actually really quite interesting, right? Whether you're a nerd or not. So I guess there are all kinds of ways of doing it. I think first and foremost, being aware of how it works and who it's supposed to work to protect. Yes.
I was so pleased, because I can't hear on the other side. I was so pleased to hear you say that you would oppose BDS if it actually hurt people from certain nationalities, and also to recommend that people look at the US ACB and the PACB website and the guidelines. I was particularly pleased to hear that because in the aftermath of the American Studies Association endorsing the boycott BDS movement, PACB changed its guidelines in 2014 and explicitly suggested that, for example, professors not sit on committees of Israeli academics, that they not read dissertations, that they not invite them to conferences, nor go to their conferences, that they reject their papers, that do things that would fundamentally undermine their ability to move forward professionally. You said that you couldn't think of anybody who had been hurt by the boycott, so I wanted to refer, Michael Zakim wrote a very powerful article in Dissent magazine, and I encourage people to take a look at it, where he said the first person who was hurt by this boycott was an Israeli Palestinian for whom he couldn't get anyone to read that young man's dissertation. So I'm wondering if you still stand by your position that BDS doesn't hurt any academics, or if in fact what you're saying is there's a conflict between what you see as the civil rights and human rights violations of Palestinians, which you feel trumps actually academic freedom in the case of BDS, which is, I think, the position you're taking. It was also Judith Butler's position, but it means it's more difficult to make the kinds of arguments that you're trying to make about both the importance of academic freedom and also the importance in other kinds of ways. And I just, it would be great if you could be honest with the room about where you stand on that.
Okay. I know that you feel like you've just performed an aha moment, and I was more appreciative of your comments before you impugned my honesty at the end. Let me say this. So everybody in this room, including you, knows where I stand. I'm going to speak honestly. Record it, tweet it, print it. I don't care. Call it contradictory. I don't care. I care about colonized people getting some damn justice, having their human rights respected, and I am not concerned, write it down, I'm not concerned with the nattering inconveniences that Israelis, who are one of the most privileged populations in the world, might have to deal with every now and again, that there are no fundamental violations of academic freedom coming out of the BDS movement. There are dozens, hundreds of violations of academic freedom, verifiable, judged, obvious, accessible, there for us to see violations coming out from pro-Israel or Zionist communities, and it's those violations of academic freedom with which we must be concerned. This argument is similar.
People can only have freedom of speech if they.
I was just going to say this sounds just like the liberal freedom of speech argument that says that we ought to cosset neo-Nazis of some sort under some vague abstract notion of free speech. No, we have to concern ourselves with the well-being, first and foremost, of communities who are continuing to suffer the deprivations and depredations of academic freedom, of colonization, and the violations of academic freedom that exists therein. We're going to go on this for a long time, so I'll end my comments by saying we're not going to agree with one another on this. That's fine. All right.
They're not a proponent of academic freedom. It's only your academic freedom that you're trying to protect. Because academic freedom is carte blanche to everyone.
But it's not. I don't have a job because I don't have academic freedom. How do you? So it's not. That's what I'm saying. It's a violation.
You were given a bum deal. You were discriminated against. Your rights were violated. But you would propose that this is okay for the same college to do the same thing to someone to whom you have different views.
But I wouldn't.
That's just ignorant.
When have I said that I would prefer somebody to be treated the way I was?
Because if it's an Israeli, it's okay. That's what you just said.
That's okay.
They're subjugating the Palestinians.
Okay.
That's got nothing to do with academic freedom.
Okay. I understand you're interpreting that way. I don't feel like that's what I said.
But that is
There's
what
a recording. We can play it back. And we'll see. Let me just say, I invite everybody in this room, no matter where you align yourself politically, read the literature, read the arguments. Seriously, make up your own mind. All right, I mean, that's all we can do at this point. You've said your piece. I've said my piece. You know, do your own research and judge whether you think that it's viable or ethical or not, and make your decision accordingly. I mean, you know, I don't think that there's anything else to do but argue at this point.
Thank you, sir. Anthony, did you have a question?
Yeah,
Can you
it's
please
shifting
ask?
a lot.
Okay.
Great.
Go ahead.
Marsha, I'll be right back.
So, like, how would you suggest, for students in particular, like a step one, per se, introducing what's happening to Palestine in an academic setting, especially when met with somebody that would refer to as anti-Semitic?
Okay. In this environment, any accusation of racism is to be taken seriously. Right? It's. I mean, I don't know how alarmist I've sounded, but I'm you know, I just returned to the United States after living abroad for a few years. Of course, I'm always watching the news and the Facebook feeds, and the environment right now, especially on campuses, is something a little bit more intense than I'm accustomed to. So, first and foremost, I would say that when anybody raises an issue of anti-Semitism, right, then the audience ought to look at it and look at it seriously. All right. If it's somebody who is speaking in criticism of the Israeli government, right, or even of Zionism, is then accused of anti-Semitism, I think that people need to come together and write in defense of that person's actions and say that it's fair to criticize the person, but in this instance it doesn't seem fair to accuse this person of racism. That this is not in fact an act of racism, then that the charge of anti-Semitism is one that is particularly dangerous given this environment. Second of all, in terms of sort of educating people, right, and what students can do, you know, these sorts of events are good. There are debates to have. There are reading groups to be made. I don't know. It's been a long time since I was a student, but I would say also that making your voices heard is critical. Those who are interested in Palestine, whether it's somebody involved with the MSA or the burgeoning SJP or whatever other group there is, to try your best to create opportunities for education and conversation. And that's just a wonderful thing about student life in general. It is bringing in speakers, hosting speakers, hosting films, and any sort of thing that brings people into the same space, right? And in that same space, they can learn more about one another. They can learn more about different points of view, and they can grow their politics. And third, I think the most important is it's important to create a sense of community, because in this environment as well, a lot of reprisal happens. SJPs haven't had an easy go of it lately at a lot of universities. MSAs haven't had an easy go of it lately, right? At a lot of universities, we live in a situation of overt racism and overt Islamophobia, and in some ways, in some cases even, those forms of racism are not simply tolerated, but rewarded, right? That you can say something horrible, right, and get rewarded for it, right? And so all of this is to say that it's crucial, I think, to bond with people within your own group, right? Your own political or ethnic or cultural or religious group, but also to reach outside of that group and to bond with people. I don't want to use the word, it's already become old-fashioned, intersectionality, right? But to bond with people across campus and to make sure that there's a kind of strength in number, that you all are in a position not only to educate each other, right, but to protect and defend one another from any sort of reprisal that comes either from on high, right, or from some spot below that you would rather just not deal with. Does that make sense? Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for that statement. Because that's what we've been doing, some of us on here, and to accept our differences and to come together to support each other when something happens, and to keep us unified for the rights of each other, and to keep that going, because that's what we need. That's what we've been doing on our campus, and that's what I want to see. And most of the kids that know me, that if there's a problem, come find me. I don't have a small voice. Might be short, but I'll stand up for you. I'll be there for you. And we disagree, we're not going to agree, but thank you for saying we need not separate. We need to unify as human beings with that common thing of humanity.
Thank you.
Jaleesa?
You might have answered this already, but can you just elaborate on the argument that some make that Zionists make the argument that Israel is their ancestral land, that they're just taking back what's theirs? Like, could you elaborate? Like, what would you say in response?
Okay. The argument, she's asking about the argument that some make on the pro-Israel side that Israel is the ancestral land of the Jewish people, and what do I make of that argument, or how I would respond to that argument. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Okay. This is for somebody like me trained in a kind of ethnic or multicultural studies, but it's the kind of question that seems really, really simple and straightforward, but leads to nothing but rabbit holes. And so so I definitely haven't answered it already, and I'll try to answer it concisely. I'll probably fail, but there are different ways to look at it, culturally, historically, linguistically, politically. So I kind of want to answer it politically. I'm not a huge fan in general. Right? I'm talking about beyond the Holy Land. All right, I'm not a huge fan of invocations of a mythological past. And I don't mean mythological as false necessarily. Mythological is something that's become a myth, a story, a narrative in our collective mind, right? Every community, every cultural or religious or ethnic community is bound together by a set of myths. Right? That's the sense in which I'm using the word. Right? I don't like invocations of a mythological past as the basis for modern political claims. I guess I'm trying to say that in the middle of the 19th century, there was a community there, right? A settler community arrived, right? And in various incarnations, those communities have been in conflict with one another ever since, with the settler community holding the vast amount of power, right? Military power, political power, etc. And that you cannot reduce any national community really to I guess you can, but it never looks nice, right? Or you shouldn't, let's say, reduce any national community to a mono-religious or unicultural existence. That you can say that, in other words, I don't know that you can trace a particular origin, right, that has a direct line to either modern Palestinians or modern Israelis, right? That too much variation of human geography of the landscape, right? DNA tests are problematic in and of themselves. Most of the DNA tests come out on the side of the Palestinians, and I still reject them, right? I would rather base my claim, right, to human rights on something other than my DNA or other than a story. Right, and so I guess what I'm trying to say is that I would suggest to somebody who makes the ancestral land argument as a basis of support for Israel, I would say that that's probably not a very wise political game to play, because it brings about more potential problems than it does solutions, and that I'm hard pressed to think of any modern settler colonial movement that hasn't in some way mythologized some kind of essential connection or claim to a piece of geography. That's part and parcel of what allows settler colonization to work. Does that make sense? That it just.
Using that argument, where would you trace back the history of when there was ever an independent Palestine for the Palestinian
But
people?
there was always a Palestinian nation. You're confusing modern nation states with national communities, and there's always been one. Read Rashid Khalidi's Palestinian Identity, Baruch Himmerling's work on the subject, Keith Whitelam. There's been a lot written about the formation of Palestinian communities.
State of Palestine.
But there was no state of Jordan until 1950. Do you know what I mean? There was
I
no.
understand, but
Right.
no one's disputing the existence of Jordan.
I'm disputing the existence of Jordan.
But before the Israelis, it was the British. Before the British, it was the Ottomans. Before them, it was the Persians. It was always somebody else ruling the land. It was never the indigenous Palestinian population, because they were always a conquered people, dating back to King David.
But they were a people. They were a nation.
Yes, and
they were a
the
national
Jews are people
community.
too, who live in the same land.
what was their-
They share the space. That should be the goal.
What was their official state before Israel? Like, I literally don't have a lot of information on this, so like, if the point
It
is
wasn't,
that
it
they
was
weren't
part
an
of it.
official state, then neither of them were official states at that point.
That's right, exactly. The UN declared them states.
Right, and so the idea that a structure of power has decided who does and who doesn't get this land that's been perpetually disputed, right? Like, I don't understand how.
The Jews accepted what the UN offered them. The Arabs didn't. That's where it started.
Yeah, but that seems like.
No, that's not where it
I-
started. That's not where it started.
I mean, I feel like I
That's
don't
the
accept what
genesis of it.
Donald Trump offers me. I don't. Like, no, people contest power, right? Like, that's part of contesting power. I don't know.
I'm gonna take the next question, and then I'm gonna come to you, Joy. Nadar, you had a question?
This question might be a little redundant, but what can we as students do to protect our professors who feel censored talking about Palestine, especially our professors who are women of color?
Okay, well, that's a great question. What can students do to help protect professors who are censored for speaking about Palestine, especially women and sorry?
Women of color.
Women of color. Sorry, women of color. Just okay. That's a terrific question. It's not redundant. Let me start answering it in the inverse, though. I would say that first and foremost, faculty have a responsibility and an obligation to protect their students from, especially their student activists, students from marginalized community from any undue pressure. And I know that there are wonderful committed faculty at Stockton, right? At least some, right? But I've been at universities where students are just taking it on the chin over and over and over again, and the faculty don't lift a finger, and it infuriates me. I think that, in fact, it might not be part of a professor's contract to defend students, right? But it's certainly part of the professor's job responsibility. So in terms of the students doing the same for faculty, I think first and foremost, students should understand that even though they're kind of low on the totem pole of things, right, in the hierarchy, students have a certain amount of power as well. And you can exercise that power. That you don't always feel listened to, and very often you are in fact ignored, right? But you are sometimes listened to, right? And you never know until you raise your voice. One thing I learned about Illinois after that whole thing went down, afterwards, in retrospect, we learned after the university's emails had been released. This is over a year after the event. The university had to release emails, and one thing we learned was that the administrators were absolutely aware of and in their own room sort of responding to what they were hearing from students, right? They were absolutely aware of what students seemed to support and not to support, and that was a real eye-opener for me. I was like, okay, so this doesn't necessarily mean that they were making policy decisions based on that knowledge, but there was an awareness. They were paying attention. And so I think that people on campus do pay attention, and that if you have to understand, when a professor is being censored, there's always an algorithm at play, right? And so the administrator's going to sit down, sometimes with lawyers, sometimes not, and they're going to decide what's the cost of disciplining this professor. If we fire this professor, how much is this professor going to ask for in a lawsuit? And how likely are we to lose this lawsuit? No, seriously, right? They were also discussing that in Illinois as well, of course, right? That was part of their job responsibility in that moment, right? We're about to do something bad, and we're going to get our asses sued. Like, what's this going to cost us? And so, if part of their deliberations is that the students are going to be upset, then that's a powerful detriment to raising punishment. So you have to make your presence known. Raise your voice, make it heard, let the administration know that you're around, that you feel like your ability to receive a good and proper education that the university promises you is impeded by the fact that the faculty don't feel free to teach. We're seeing this at Drexel University. We're following the case of George Marr. And he just got put on administrative leave, right? Because he's been embroiled in all kinds of controversies. Basically, a lot of sort of alt-right types are after him, and his administration caved. And they put him on administrative leave. And what his students responded with, I thought, was very powerful. They said, "We have a right to learn in this man's classroom. We signed up for his class." And so these are very strong arguments, and so take whatever opportunity you're given as students, at least on issues that are important to you or that feel crucial to you, to make your voice heard. Don't give in to the cynicism that none of it matters, right? At least wait till your 30s before you become cynical. You know what I mean? Like, it's, college age is too young. That you'll be surprised sometimes who your opinion reaches. All right, and whose ear it lands on. And also, another way is just keep lines of communication open with your professors. Right? I think students sometimes are either intimidated or nervous or feel like the professor doesn't want to hear from them, but any good professor wants to hear from you. Any good professor is delighted to hear from you, and any good professor is going to be doubly delighted that you're willing to support that professor in her struggle or in his struggle. And so just say, well, hey, what do you need me to do? And just the very gesture, provides like this amazing sort of psychic recharge. So I guess those are some of the things off the top of my head that come to mind. Thank you.
We're gonna take like 3 more questions, so I have 2 already lined up. Joy, can you please?
I just want to say, I love the presentation. I think most of us understand where you're coming from and what you're saying. We definitely agree. And that you should probably try to be a Professor Gary, even if it's
There you go.
I mean, the things, there's so many points of view, and that's good. It's a good thing. And I definitely think you should try. You'll probably get like all the signatures you'll need and more.
Thank you. I like the idea, but no. But let me say that I've been sort of locked in various battles, over the past 3 or 4 years, and so I'm ready to take a little bit of a break. But I do relish the opportunity to come and to visit campuses and to interact with students and to argue with people and to hone my own arguments, and all of these sorts of things. So I really appreciate it. That's a very kind thing to say, and I'll after this year, I'll look out for the job ads, and if anything happens, you start bothering Professor Miyashiro and tell him to hot step it and start hiring people.
Sean King was here before.
Yeah.
And he's a contributor to the show that I watch. You can think about being a contributor to different, things that we watch too. Like the one he
Ah, okay.
So I don't know if you've heard of it before.
I have.
Yeah, so you might want to try that too, then.
And the problem is I have a face made for radio, but but no, I appreciate it. I am thinking about becoming like a lead guitarist or a drummer or something, but I feel like I'm a little bit old to learn the instrument. But who knows? The thing is, this is the thing about life, and I don't know. In some ways, it's a useful lesson for you that people all the time have to reinvent themselves, right? In their 20s or their 30s or their 40s or even their 50s or the 60s. And thank you. I'll manage to reinvent myself and do something that I hope is useful and that doesn't make me completely miserable. All right.
Alright, so, right here.
I'm really happy that you talked about violation of human rights in Gaza and West Bank. But since we heard from a lot of people in the crowd, or from at least one person, that there are a lot of people here that have no prior knowledge and background of the politics and the situation in that region, I think it's completely dishonest. And before you said you're going to talk honestly, I think it's completely dishonest not to talk about the primary violators of human rights in the West Bank and Gaza, namely Hamas in Gaza, which is not allowing any of the humanitarian aid that Israel is sending, that the world is sending to get to the people. They are taking it, they are taking away the materials, the food, everything that's being sent, they're keeping for themselves. They're using men, women, and children, innocent men, women, and children as human shields. They're putting their military centers into hospitals and schools. And to not mention Hamas seems very dishonest in giving an accurate picture. I'm curious how you feel about Hamas. In particular, I'd like you to let us know, do you condemn Hamas?
I mean, I consider Hamas to be
A terrorist organization?
the democratically elected government of the Gaza Strip, and I don't involve myself or concern myself with the affairs of the people of the Gaza Strip, of whom I don't
Human rights are
belong.
being
Can
violated.
you please
That's
let
what
him
we care
finish the
about.
sentence? That's out of respect of our speaker, but thank you.
Here, let me tell you what I don't do as a general rule. I understand what you're getting at and what you're asking me to do, but I do want to take an opportunity on behalf of particularly the MSA students and the would-be SJP students, because what's just been performed is known in circles of people of color as being asked to perform a respectability politics. And I'm not going to, on principle, condemn Hamas or call Hamas terrorist or engage in the act of condemning Palestinian human rights or so-called Palestinian violations of human rights as an entree into respectability of conversation. That I don't, the feature of the particular question that you raise has been a central feature of Palestinian life in the United States for 30 or 40 years, maybe even longer, and certainly ever since I came into adulthood and started speaking about this topic. I've never been able, until recently anyway, when I decided I was no longer going to do it, I was never able to speak about Palestine or about Arabs or about Islam without first putting forward the qualification that I'm not violent, or that I don't support terrorism, or that I'm not a terrorist, or distancing myself from this or that particular political movement. And this is a problem because this is not an injunction that seems to exist in the inverse. Nobody who supports Israel, when they get on TV, is asked to condemn the settler movement, or to condemn Netanyahu, or to condemn Likud, or anything else. And so I'm not talking about the rightness or the wrongness of Palestinian politics. What I'm talking about are the structures of power that are governing this interchange, and the fact that I refuse to participate in upholding those structures of power, that I, as somebody of Palestinian background, refuse the condition that I perform respectability for the comfort of somebody in the audience who is professing to be a political opponent. I just won't do it. I can't do it. And you're factually incorrect when you say that Hamas is a bigger violator and perpetrator of human rights than Israel. There are human rights reports all over the internet. Anybody can get them, access them, and read them. The human rights violations were brazen. They are well documented. They have been arbitrated over and over again, and that it strikes me in a sense as especially gross and in a sense morally grotesque to try to blame Palestinians themselves for the suffering that they have endured and experienced, particularly in the Gaza Strip and particularly in the summer of 2014, where over 2,000 people were killed, including over 500 children.
Well, because of that, because we feel comfortable condemning a known terrorist organization like Hamas, my message to the people in the room is, you may want to, think of, if you're getting a history of the area and the region from someone who's maybe doesn't feel comfortable condemning a known terrorist organization, you might want to just look around a little more and just educate a little more, because there might be a lot more to the story that is not being shared, and that's what I'd like to share.
I agree with the gentleman. Read up, check your own sources.
You have state terrorism, but that's not called terrorism from the state. You see what I'm saying? So if you're occupying somewhere and you have a few people fight back, you can't call an entire group terrorists.
They are, as he said, they're the leaders of the area.
If I may interrupt, what feels dishonest to me is that you lead a group of students on a birthright trip and you take pictures with the terrorist organization, IDF soldiers, and those pictures, I have friends in this room who are no longer friends of mine because of this. So if you're talking about a colonization, if you want to talk about a military group, if you want to talk about terrorization, that's what feels dishonest, is you leaving that very important piece out.
I'm not sure.
You're not sure what I mean?
I'm not sure.
It's not
Who gets to
terrorist
define
organization.
terrorism? That's my sociological question.
Well,
Who gets to define terrorism?
IDF doesn't pay $50,000 to a family who lets their child wear a suicide bomb.
All right, listen.
Okay.
Hold on, stop. This is where I have to step in, because if there's one thing that I absolutely refuse to entertain or tolerate as part of any discussion I'm participating in, I will walk. I know if it makes some of you happy, is the idea that Palestinians inculcate their children into violence. That is a vicious sort of racism. It's irresponsible. That I won't have. You can hush it on me. Leave. Don't even with Palestinian children, and none of the mythologies about Palestinian children being violent, because that has led to a kind of suffering that I would not wish on anybody, not only in this room, but in the entire world.
Let's just distort what I said. I did not accuse Palestinian families or parents of doing that to their children. I accused Hamas of paying families when their adult child decides to go and kill people. I don't believe that the average Palestinian is any more violent or hateful than any Jew in the world.
Okay. Then, pardon my
And
implication.
I've been to the Gaza Strip and I've been to the West Bank many times, and I know Palestinian people and Israeli Arabs, the 1.8 million Israeli Arabs who live within Israel, would not want to live under the Palestinian Authority.
That's an example.
But nobody wants to live on our So, if there is anything other... Me? Oh, I just said people always have problems living under someone else's authority.
That's what he's saying. The 1.8 million people, they're happy. They say we want to live in Israel because they treat us well.
But the West Bank exists because they were kicked out.
But this becomes
No, I
utilitarian.
can't. You can't
It's legal.
speak for the 7 million Israelis either. They're not most Israelis support the peace process. And they don't agree with their government, or necessarily even the military.
The 1.8 million Arabs in Israel, let's give the full information, making it sound like they're just any other community. There are legally second-class citizens They are not allowed to buy land and build in the same way that Jewish communities are. They're very often not allowed in municipal swimming pools that are reserved for Jews. They are second-class citizens. It's a historical fact.
I
It's
worked
been
2
over
years-
and over.
I worked 2 years in Laniado Hospital in Netanya. 40% of the patients were Arabs from the West Bank, from the city of Tulkarm.
They are second-class citizens.
They
The-
got free
you might as well
treatment
just
inside
go into
Israel.
Alabama in 1950 and say blacks have just as many rights as whites do. That's exactly what you were arguing.
not the
That's
same
exactly
thing.
what you were
West Bank
arguing.
is not
That's
part of
exactly what you were
Israel.
arguing. That's exactly what you're arguing.
Thank you. This is our last question. After this, if you have any comments, please, in respect to our speaker here, please keep them to yourselves because the Q&A will end with this. And yes, please ask your question.
Okay, so now that we're all thoroughly heated, I just want to bring back to the point that, like, no matter what side you're on, I think we should all agree that we all want peace in the land, whether you call it Palestine or Israel. And so I want to ask you if you think it is feasible to have any sort of compromise between the Palestinian and Israeli people without, like, kicking people out. Whether it's feasible to have Palestinian refugees to come back and, like, and Israeli Palestinians live peacefully side by side. And if so, how do you think that is possible?
Okay, thank you. That's a good question for ending it. I do. I'm optimistic. I am. I'm not a statistician, so I don't know about the nuts and bolts, but politically, ethically, conceptually, I support. I think a lot of people support the idea of a binational state. Even better would be a binational nation, right? But we're dealing with states and not nations here. In the end, I do think that there is opportunity geographically and politically for the refugees to come back should they desire that return. Some of them will take it up, many of them won't, but they should have that right. They have that right under international law, in fact. I don't support any sort of final status, final compromise, whatever you want to call it, full-on peace settlement, permanent peace settlement that would involve anybody necessarily getting displaced or anybody getting displaced. And in this sense, I think one of the most difficult issues around the two-state solution are the amount of Israeli settlers in the West Bank and the kind of conflict that might arise should the Israeli state try to remove significant numbers of them in exchange as part of a land for peace deal, right? And then the kind of infighting that might accrue. But I like, more than anything, I like the idea of erasing the borders, democracy for everybody there. It could end up being some sort of federation, but some sort of constitutional system in which everybody's basic fundamental rights are protected, and that where no tiers of citizenship exist based on race, nationality, religion, or anything else. In terms of the fine print that would need to be worked out in that sort of settlement, it would be a very, very long document indeed, and an idea that the political brokers would be none too happy with. But if you're asking me as a layperson, that would be the simplest and easiest vision that I have as somebody who is concerned with that part of the world for a so-called peace settlement, something that involves everybody and something that doesn't involve any further displacement or dispossession. But I'm also afflicted with that particular problem of having sort of a pie-in-the-sky political mentality that I don't like it when I'm in a debate with somebody like on Facebook or whatever, and they tell me, oh, you know, that's not realistic, be pragmatic. It's like, well, you always have to start with the best possible outcome, right? I mean, that's what you start with, and you see if you can make it there. If you can make it there, that's awesome, right? If not, then you figure it out as you go along, right? But for me, the ideal, the outcome that would seem to be fairest and best would be a binational democracy of some sort, wherein no tiers of citizenship, no tiers of belonging exist, and where everybody is treated equally under the eyes of the law.
All right. Wow. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Personally, I don't want this to end, but
It was a fun night. Thank you all so much.